The old seaside estate had been polished into brilliance for the day, every chandelier glittering like a constellation caught inside the ballroom, every table arranged with precision, the murmur of distinguished voices rising and falling like waves beyond the heavy oak doors. Yet Natalie Morgan stood apart from it all, in the marble restroom at the end of a quiet corridor, and stared into a mirror that seemed far too honest. The gown clung perfectly, ivory crepe catching the soft light as if the fabric itself had been spun to flatter her frame. Pearls dotted her chestnut hair, pinned into a chignon with elegant precision, the sort of detail her father's money could ensure. To the guests waiting just beyond the threshold, she was the picture of grace, a bride marrying into stability, a daughter sealing an alliance between her family's legacy and the man who promised to cherish her. But Natalie couldn't see what they saw. Her eyes in the mirror refused to lie. They reflected doubt, fear, and a grief she had never outrun. Her hand trembled slightly as she touched the counter, the cool stone grounding her as her breath fluttered unevenly. She told herself to smile, to remember that this was what her father wanted, what society expected. Thomas Morgan, shipping magnate, respected in every Boston boardroom, had placed his faith in Christopher Hale, a man whose ambition seemed as endless as the Atlantic rolling against the rocks outside. Chris was reliable, practical, a partner who promised security. He had been patient through her grief, a steady presence in the year after tragedy swallowed her whole. But the tragedy still lived with her. Daniel Brooks. His name rose unbidden, filling the silence of the restroom like a ghost at her shoulder. Daniel, whose laughter once filled her apartment, whose hand on her back made the world feel certain, whose ring she had worn with uncomplicated joy. Daniel, who never made it home that night on the highway, whose overturned car and flashing ambulance lights still haunted her sleep. She had been 26 when she buried the man she thought would be her forever, and now, at 27, she stood in a wedding dress that Daniel had never seen, preparing to vow her life to another man. Was this survival or betrayal? Her father had said it was time to move forward. Chris had whispered that Daniel would have wanted her to be happy. Everyone had agreed that grief should not hold her hostage forever. But standing here, her eyes blurred with unshed tears, Natalie wondered if marrying Chris meant leaving Daniel behind completely. And she didn't know if she could. She pressed her forehead briefly against the mirror, closing her eyes, trying to quiet the storm. The ring on her finger, a platinum band with a modest diamond, glittered in the lamplight. It was tasteful, understated, the kind of ring Chris believed appropriate for a future built on strategy and restraint. But it wasn't the ring Daniel would have chosen. Daniel had once joked that she was the most precious stone he'd ever hold, that no diamond could outshine her. The memory stabbed and soothed all at once, a reminder of the simplicity she had lost. Laughter drifted faintly from the ballroom, the muffled rise of toasts and music. In less than 10 minutes, she would be summoned to return, to lift a glass of champagne and smile for photographs, to stand beside Chris as if she belonged at his side without hesitation. And yet her chest tightened with each passing second, as if the gown itself constricted around her. What am I doing? She thought. What am I agreeing to? Her reflection gave no answer. The restroom door creaked open softly, a sound too small to be alarming, yet enough to pull her back from the cliff edge of memory. Natalie straightened, brushing a stray strand of hair back into place, bracing herself for one of her bridesmaids, or perhaps her father coming to coax her into returning. But it wasn't them. In the mirror behind her stood a man in a waiter's uniform. He was older, his gray hair neatly trimmed, his expression marked by the quiet dignity of someone used to being overlooked in crowded rooms. His eyes, however, were steady, too steady, as if he had entered with purpose rather than by accident. Natalie blinked, startled. "I'll be right out," she said quickly, her voice polite, embarrassed to have been caught with tears glistening in her eyes. The man didn't retreat. He adjusted the bow tie at his collar, his fingers betraying a nervous habit, and shook his head slightly. His voice, when he spoke, was low but carried an unexpected weight. "Please, miss," he said gently, "forgive me for intruding, but there's something I need to tell you." Natalie felt her stomach knot, the unease she had been fighting all afternoon sharpening suddenly into something colder. She turned fully toward him, her pulse stuttering in her throat. "What is it?" The waiter's gaze flicked to the floor, as though he was measuring his words. His hands were steady now, his tone careful but urgent. And in that suspended moment, with her gown shimmering under the lamps and her doubts coiled tight around her, Natalie Morgan sensed that whatever he was about to say would change everything. The waiter did not move closer at first. He lingered by the door, his voice low enough to be swallowed by the pipes in the walls. "Don't drink from the flute with the peach ribbon," he said. "Your fiancé slipped something into it." Natalie froze. The words landed with the weight of an accusation she could not process. Her first instinct was to laugh, to dismiss, to insist this man had mistaken her for someone else. But nothing in his eyes suggested confusion or malice. They were steady, haunted, carrying a truth that seemed too sharp to fabricate. "What?" Her voice cracked, too loud in the tiled room. "That's impossible. You must be mistaken." "I wish I were," the man replied. He glanced toward the door again, then stepped forward, lowering his voice even more. "I set the head table myself. I saw him drop something into the glass with the peach ribbon. He was careful, but not careful enough." Natalie shook her head, clutching the counter for balance. "Chris wouldn't, he's not." The denial rose quickly, an instinctive shield. Christopher Hale had been her lifeline when the world had collapsed. He had been patient, supportive, always at her side when she struggled to breathe past grief. To believe this stranger was to unravel everything she had told herself about moving forward. The waiter didn't press, didn't argue. His expression held no satisfaction at her disbelief. Instead, it held sorrow, deep and carved into every line of his face. "I've been working events like these for 20 years, he said. "I've seen hundreds of weddings, hundreds of couples. I know when something's wrong. And I know the look of a man hiding something he doesn't want his bride to see." Natalie's chest rose and fell too quickly, panic skimming the edges of her thoughts. She wanted to insist again that he was wrong, that Chris had no reason to do such a thing. But the echo of doubt had already lodged itself inside her, spreading like a crack in glass. She swallowed hard. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "If this were true, why would you take the risk?" The man's lips tightened. For a moment, his gaze drifted past her, into some memory he couldn't shake. "Because I had a daughter once," he said quietly. "She trusted the wrong man. There were warnings she didn't listen to. And when the truth came out, it was too late to save her." His voice faltered, but did not break. "I couldn't stop what happened to her. But maybe I can stop what's about to happen to you." The room seemed to tilt again, the chandelier's reflection swimming in the mirror behind her. Natalie's breath caught. Something inside her cracked open. Compassion for this stranger's grief, terror for her own safety, and the sickening realization that his words explained the unease that had gnawed at her all day. Her mind raced. What could possibly be in the champagne? A sedative? Something worse? Chris had been attentive, affectionate even, but she remembered the moments that had unsettled her. The way his eyes lingered too long when she mentioned Daniel, the sharp edge in his tone when she hesitated about the wedding. Could she have missed something darker beneath his calm exterior? The waiter, Henry Collins, though she didn't yet know his name, took a step back, as if giving her space to breathe. "Don't cause a scene," he advised. "Just switch the glasses when no one's watching. Make it look like nothing more than a whim, a superstition. If I'm wrong, all you'll have wasted is a moment's comfort. But if I'm right," he let the words trail off, the silence carrying more weight than any warning could. Natalie pressed her hands together to steady the tremor in her fingers. She wanted to demand proof, to hear certainty instead of implication. Yet the man's eyes carried a sincerity she couldn't dismiss. And beneath her denial, a thread of fear wound tighter and tighter, as if her body knew something her mind refused to say aloud. Aye, her voice faltered. She nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. The warning was hers now, whether she believed it or not. The waiter gave her one last look, something between regret and resolve, before glancing toward the corridor. "Be careful," he said softly. Then he slipped out as quietly as he had entered, leaving her with the echo of his words and the reflection of a woman who no longer trusted the day she had stepped into. Natalie stared at herself again, but the bride in the mirror looked altered, changed in some invisible way. The gown was the same, the pearls in her hair still gleamed, but her eyes were wide, alert, suspicious. Fear and doubt had etched themselves into her expression. She drew a breath, steadying herself as best she could. Outside, the music was swelling, the laughter of guests carrying through the hall. Soon someone would come looking for her, reminding her it was time to rejoin the celebration. She turned, smoothing the front of her dress with hands that still trembled. Whatever waited for her in that ballroom, she could no longer walk into it blindly. The weight of the warning pressed against her chest, each word echoing in rhythm with her pulse. Don't drink. Switch the glasses. Be careful. With her face composed into a smile that didn't touch her eyes, Natalie stepped out of the restroom and into the golden corridor of the estate, carrying with her a new, unshakable unease. She moved toward the sound of voices and clinking glassware, her mind a storm of disbelief and dread, and though no one could see it yet, she had crossed an invisible threshold, one where innocence ended and suspicion began. The ballroom had reached its crescendo of expectation. Guests leaned forward in their seats, glasses lifted, waiting for the signal that would open the evening's celebration. Candles flickered in tall crystal holders, throwing golden light across linen as smooth as ocean foam. The scent of roses and salt air mingled in the vast space, the estate's arched windows framing the restless Atlantic beyond. Natalie walked back toward the head table, every step measured, her expression carefully schooled into serenity. Inside, her pulse was a staccato rhythm, beating against the warning she could not silence. She found Chris exactly where she had left him, beside her father, speaking with effortless ease, his tuxedo perfectly cut, his posture projecting unshakable confidence. He turned at her approach, smiling as though she were the center of gravity itself. "There you are," he said warmly, slipping an arm around her waist. To anyone watching, he was the image of a devoted groom. But Natalie felt the weight of his hand, the way his eyes searched hers for more than affection. They searched for control. On the table before them, 2 champagne flutes waited, one tied with a peach ribbon to match her bouquet, the other looped with blue to echo the coastal sky. The difference seemed insignificant to every guest in the room, but to Natalie it was everything. She lowered herself into her seat, fingers brushing the stem of the peach flute. It looked ordinary, harmless, the bubbles catching light as they rose and burst at the surface. Yet her chest tightened as though the liquid already burned her throat. Chris leaned close, his lips brushing her temple. "You were gone a while. Everything all right?" "Nerves," she answered softly, smiling as if her words carried no weight. "It's a big day." "The biggest," he said, squeezing her hand. His tone was warm, but his gaze lingered on the glasses. The master of ceremonies raised his microphone, calling the room to attention. Silverware stilled, conversations fell quiet, anticipation thickened. The first toast was moments away. Natalie drew in a breath and made her decision. She reached toward the blue flute, her smile widening just enough to look playful. "You know," she said lightly, "there's an old superstition. If newlyweds switch glasses before the first toast, it means a long and happy life together." Her words floated easily across the table, casual to the guests, but she kept her eyes locked on Chris. For a heartbeat, his face didn't change. Then something flickered, quick, sharp, gone as soon as it appeared. His hand shot out, stopping her wrist just shy of the glass. "No," he said, too firmly, too fast. Then he softened his tone, laughing as if covering impatience. "I mean, Everything should be done properly. Peach for you, blue for me. Traditions matter. Natalie's smile did not falter, but inside her blood ran cold. His reaction was too quick, too defensive. It was confirmation she hadn't wanted but could no longer ignore. The waiter's warning echoed in her mind like a bell. "Of course," she said sweetly, easing back as though yielding. "As you say." The MC's voice swelled over the speakers, inviting everyone to rise. Glasses were lifted, words of blessing prepared. Natalie's hand trembled slightly as she touched the peach flute again. She forced a laugh at her own clumsiness, tipping the stem just enough. "Oh!" she exclaimed, stumbling against the table. The champagne sloshed and spilled, a golden stream soaking the white linen and staining it like a wound. Guests chuckled sympathetically, the small accident dismissed as nerves from an overwhelmed bride. Chris's eyes, however, betrayed him. For an instant, rage flashed there, sharp, dangerous, uncontrolled. The mask returned almost instantly, his smile practiced and reassuring, but Natalie had seen it. The truth had cracked through. "Clumsy me," she said, her voice apologetic, her cheeks warm with feigned embarrassment. "Darling, may I take yours? You can get another." It was a request no groom could refuse in front of an audience. Chris hesitated for the briefest of seconds, then placed his glass into her hand with a gentle smile. "Of course, my love," he said smoothly, waving to a waiter. "Please, another champagne for me." Natalie accepted the blue flute, her fingers steady now. Across the room, the same gray-haired waiter appeared with a tray, slipping a fresh glass into Chris's reach. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. He gave the faintest nod, and she knew he had seen everything. The toast began, voices rising in unison. Natalie lifted the glass to her lips, smiling radiantly for the cameras, her heart pounding so hard she feared someone might hear it. She sipped, cool bubbles rushing across her tongue, nothing more than champagne. She held her gaze on Chris as she drank, watching his face with the precision of a hunter. Chris raised his new glass as well, his mask firmly in place, the picture of a devoted groom. But beneath the practiced smile, the fury still simmered, visible only to the woman who now held proof in her hand. Applause erupted around them, laughter and music rising once again as the evening rolled forward. The bouquet waited to be tossed, the cake to be cut, the dance floor to open. To the guests, nothing was amiss. The celebration gleamed with perfection. But for Natalie, every note of music, every clink of glass carried a shadow. She had seen the truth in Chris's eyes, felt the rage in the tension of his hand, recognized the mask that no longer fooled her. The warning had been right. Something dangerous lurked beneath the surface of her marriage, and the danger was sitting beside her, smiling at the world. She returned the smile, but inside, her certainty crystallized. Whatever story had begun tonight, it would not be the one Chris imagined. The band struck the first soft notes of a waltz, and the ballroom stilled as if the whole room inhaled together. The master of ceremonies announced the moment everyone had been waiting for, the first dance of the bride and groom. Guests set down their glasses, leaning forward with indulgent smiles. Cameras lifted, ready to capture perfection. Chris turned to Natalie with a flourish, bowing slightly as though he were every inch the gentleman. His hand extended, waiting. She placed her fingers in his, her face the very image of serenity, though her heart beat sharp and uneven. He led her onto the polished dance floor, light catching the sequins stitched into her gown, and the crowd erupted into soft applause. He held her with practiced grace, one hand at her waist, the other guiding hers, and together they began to move. To the guests, they glided seamlessly, a couple swept away in romance. But Natalie felt the pressure of his fingers digging just a little too tightly against her side. His smile was wide, dazzling, but it never reached his eyes. "You really shouldn't test me," Chris murmured, his lips so close to her ear that anyone watching would mistake it for a lover's whisper. "This is our day. Don't ruin it." Her breath caught, but she forced herself to laugh softly, twirling as the cameras flashed. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered back, her voice steady though her pulse raced. "You do," he said, spinning her back into his arms. "That little stunt with the glass, don't try it again. People are watching, and you won't like what happens if you embarrass me." Natalie lifted her chin, plastering on the smile expected of a bride, swept off her feet. Around them, the guests sighed and clapped in rhythm with the music. But inside, her stomach twisted, each note of the waltz tightening the vice around her ribs. She could not let them see. She could not let him see her fear. The dance carried them through graceful arcs, his movements precise, hers obedient. He leaned closer again, his voice a blade wrapped in silk. "Whatever you think you're doing, stop. You agreed to marry me. That means you trust me." Her throat tightened. "Do I?" she whispered, daring the question. He stiffened, only for a second, before recovering with another smile for the crowd. He twirled her again, and as she spun back, his grip caught her with deliberate force, making her stumble just slightly before he steadied her. To the onlookers, it was seamless. To Natalie, it was a warning. When the music slowed, his hand slid lower on her waist, pulling her closer than comfort allowed. "Relax," he said smoothly, though his voice was sharp. "You're trembling. People will think you're nervous about the dance." "I am nervous," she replied softly, staring just past his shoulder, "because I don't understand what you put in my glass." Chris's smile never faltered. He twirled her once more, the skirt of her gown fanning across the floor, then leaned in as applause began to build. "Sleeping pills," he whispered. "Nothing dangerous, just enough to help you relax. You've been so tense, and I thought you needed a little help." Her chest went cold. "Without telling me—" "It's called being considerate, Natalie," he said, his tone honeyed for the crowd, but venomous in her ear. "You looked exhausted. I didn't want you unraveling in front of everyone. I take care of you. That's what this is." The music ended with a flourish, and he bowed dramatically, kissing her hand as guests erupted into cheers. Natalie forced a radiant smile, blinking against the sting in her eyes, her body trembling beneath the performance. As they left the floor, he kept her close, his lips grazing her ear once more. "See? Perfect. No one saw a thing." But she had, and she could never unsee it. They slipped aside near the edge of the room, the din of laughter and music cushioning their voices. Natalie found her courage then, pulling her hand from his grip. "That's not care, Chris," she whispered sharply. "That's control. You don't drug someone you claim to love." His eyes narrowed, though his smile stayed fixed. "Drug? Don't be dramatic. It was a sedative, mild. You'd have woken up rested, radiant. Everyone would have praised me for being such a thoughtful husband." Her pulse thundered. She studied him, his composure, his certainty, and something clicked. He knew too much. He spoke too smoothly. And then he said it. "You think I don't notice when you still cry over him?" His voice dropped lower, colder. "Daniel, the little rituals, the photograph under your pillow, the cemetery visits. Do you really think you've hidden any of it from me?" Natalie's breath caught in her throat. She had never told him about the photograph. No one knew except her therapist. A chill ran down her spine. "How do you know that?" she whispered, her voice breaking. He shrugged, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "You talk in your sleep. Or maybe your friend mentioned it. Does it matter? The point is, I know you better than you think." The blood drained from her face. The doubt that had gnawed at her since the restroom solidified into terror. He had been watching her, studying her. For how long? The guests nearby laughed, oblivious, as champagne flutes clinked and music swelled again. To them, Natalie and Chris were the perfect couple. But Natalie knew now her marriage had just begun, and already it was a cage. The suite overlooked the dark sweep of the harbor, its wide windows framing Boston's skyline, glittering against the black water. Inside, rose petals had been scattered across a king-sized bed, Champagne sat chilling in a silver bucket, and the faint hum of the sea below seemed to underscore every heartbeat. To anyone else, it was the pinnacle of romance. To Natalie, it felt like a stage dressed for a lie. Chris closed the door behind them, the click of the lock unusually sharp in the silence. He turned toward her with the same smile he had worn all evening, but the warmth was gone. His eyes had cooled hard as glass. "Finally," he said, loosening his tie with deliberate calm. "Just us." Natalie stayed near the window, the lace of her gown catching the city's glow. She kept her expression neutral, but her pulse raced. "Why, Chris?" she whispered, unable to hold it back. "What was in my glass?" He paused, studied her, then chuckled softly as if amused by her persistence. "Sleeping pills," he admitted easily, pouring himself a measure of whiskey from the minibar. "Mild, nothing dangerous. You were tense, jittery. I thought it would help you relax." Natalie's hands clenched at her sides. "Without telling me, on my wedding night." He swirled the glass, amber liquid catching the light. "You would have argued, and I didn't want arguments. I wanted peace, for both of us." He sipped, then leaned against the counter, casual in a way that made her skin crawl. "But that's not what's really bothering you, is it?" Her throat tightened. "What do you mean?" Chris's smile thinned. "Daniel," he said quietly. The name landed like a blow. "You still dream about him. You still visit his grave. You kept his photograph under your pillow for months. Don't look so surprised. I know more than you think." The air left her lungs. That secret, no one knew it but her therapist. "How do you know that?" she demanded, her voice trembling. He shrugged, too smoothly. "Because I wanted to know. I've been watching you for a long time, Natalie. Long before we met." The room seemed to tilt. She backed a step toward the window, her gown brushing the floor. "What are you saying?" Chris set the glass down and straightened, the mask of affection falling completely away. His voice sharpened into something clinical, practiced. "I didn't find you by chance. I studied you, followed you, and Daniel, too." Her chest constricted, a sick recognition dawning. "Daniel's accident," Chris's eyes gleamed, cruel satisfaction creeping into his tone. "It wasn't an accident. He was in the way. Too independent, too principled. Men like him don't survive in this business. The traffic light malfunction was convenient, but it wasn't luck. It was planned." The world fractured around her. Natalie gripped the window frame to keep from collapsing. "You killed him," she whispered, horror flooding her veins. "I removed an obstacle," Chris corrected, his calmness more chilling than rage. "And it worked, didn't it? You were broken, vulnerable. Perfect timing for me to step in, to be the man who saved you." Tears stung her eyes, but rage burned hotter beneath them. "Why? Why go to such lengths?" He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the carpet. "Because your father is the key. Thomas Morgan owns influence, contracts, connections that men like me spend lifetimes chasing. And you? You're his daughter, his heart. Through you, I gained access to him. The land by the harbor, the old warehouse district, will be mine. A shopping center worth millions. It's already in motion." Natalie shook her head, disbelief warring with fury. "You married me for business?" Chris laughed softly, almost pityingly. "Don't sound so shocked. You're beautiful, intelligent, enjoyable company. I won't deny that. But love? That's a luxury men like me can't afford. I combine business with pleasure. That's all this has ever been." She felt the ground slip beneath her feet, rage boiling up, grief twisting sharp in her chest. The man she had leaned on, trusted, led into her most fragile moments. He had orchestrated her fiancé's death, then built his future on her sorrow. "You're a monster," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm an entrepreneur," Chris countered coolly. "And we're married now. That means appearances must be maintained. Which brings me to my proposal." Her stomach lurched. "Proposal?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice as though negotiating a deal. 18 months. That's all I need. You play the role of the happy wife until I've secured the contracts, finished the project, and collected everything I came for. Then, when the timing is right, we'll divorce. Amicably. Incompatibility, irreconcilable differences, whatever story you want. I'll even sign over one of the apartments to you. Generous, isn't it? Natalie stared at him, fury blazing beneath her fear. And if I refuse? His eyes darkened, though his smile remained. Then I'll make your life miserable until you beg me to agree. And no one will believe you, Natalie. Not your father, not the police. You'll sound paranoid, unstable. Just another grieving bride who can't let go of her past. Her hands shook, but she forced herself to stand tall, to meet his gaze. Inside, she was crumbling, but outwardly she masked it with silence. Chris studied her a moment longer, then softened his tone, as if sealing a contract. Think about it. It's the smart choice. Natalie forced herself to nod faintly, her expression blank. I'll think about it, she whispered. Satisfied, he returned to his whiskey, humming faintly as though the conversation had been nothing more than a business negotiation. Natalie turned back to the window, the city lights shimmering beyond the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, pale but steady. She had given him what he wanted, apparent compliance. But inside, a vow formed as clear and cold as the harbor at night. She would not be his pawn. She would not let Daniel's death go unanswered. Chris thought he had one, but he had underestimated her. Tonight, Natalie Morgan decided she would destroy him. From the outside, Natalie became the image of a dutiful bride. She smiled in photographs, laughed at Chris's jokes, stood beside him at dinners hosted by her father's colleagues. To anyone watching, she seemed pliant, subdued, folded neatly into the role of Mrs. Hale. But inside, every word he had confessed that night replayed with sickening clarity. Daniel's accident, the calculated courtship, the scheme to use her family. She knew then that survival depended on patience. To fight openly would be suicide. Chris had made that clear. So she wore the mask he expected, waiting for the moments when his attention slipped, when his guard eased just enough for her to move. Weeks into their marriage, Chris traveled frequently, meetings, site visits, networking events across Boston. He thrived on deals, contracts, and handshakes. For Natalie, his absences became opportunities. One gray afternoon, in their Beacon Hill apartment, she began searching. Her hands trembled as she opened drawers in his office, rifled through folders stacked with real estate proposals and zoning board minutes. At first, everything looked ordinary: contracts, architectural sketches, receipts for business dinners. But she kept going, driven by something colder than fear. In the back of a locked cabinet, she found a thin envelope marked only with a date. Her breath caught when she opened it. Inside were photographs, grainy but unmistakable. The mangled remains of Daniel's car, the highway slick with rain, shards of glass scattered like confetti across the asphalt. She remembered standing in that storm, weeping as flashing lights blurred around her, but she had never seen these angles, close-ups of the twisted metal, the traffic light above the intersection. Her stomach lurched. These weren't newspaper clippings. They were crime scene photographs. Chris had kept them. Natalie staggered back, pressing a hand to her mouth. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Why would he keep these unless he had needed them? For study, for proof, for control. She forced herself to keep digging. Behind the photographs lay a slip of paper with an address scribbled in Chris's handwriting. It wasn't one she recognized, but something about the neatness of the scrawl made her blood run cold. A storage unit. That night, while Chris entertained investors across town, Natalie took a taxi through the misted streets to a warehouse district on the edge of Boston Harbor. The neighborhood was quiet, industrial, the kind of place where secrets stayed buried under salt and rust. She clutched the key she had stolen from his desk, its edges biting into her palm. The facility was nearly empty at that hour. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she walked the narrow corridor, the smell of dust and oil heavy in the air. Her heart pounded so violently she feared it might echo off the metal doors. Unit 317. The number stared back at her in chipped paint. She slid the key into the lock, her breath shaking as the latch clicked. Inside, the air was cool and stale. Boxes stacked against the walls, a folding table in the corner, maps pinned to corkboard. At first glance, it looked like an archive of a businessman's ambitions. But as Natalie stepped closer, the truth surfaced like a shark breaking water. On the table lay files labeled with dates that matched her own life. One folder contained surveillance photographs of her apartment from months before she had even spoken to Chris. Another detailed Daniel's routines, his commute times, his gym visits, even the nights he met Natalie for dinner. Her knees weakened. She braced herself against the table, flipping page after page. Notes scrawled in Chris's hand described Option A, traffic light malfunction, and Option B, brake line tampering. Her chest constricted as she realized he had considered multiple ways to eliminate Daniel, as though choosing from a menu. A spiral notebook sat open with lists of contacts, phone numbers and payments. Some names were unfamiliar, others were tied to city officials and contractors her father often mentioned. It was bigger than just her. Chris hadn't acted alone. Natalie pressed a hand to her mouth, nausea rising. She wanted to run, to scream, to burn the unit to the ground. But another part of her, colder, harder, forced her to steady herself. This was the proof she needed, the evidence that could bring him down. Her vision blurred as tears threatened, but she blinked them away. She couldn't afford weakness now. She took out her phone, snapping photo after photo, her hands trembling but determined. Each image was a nail in Chris's coffin. The maps, the payment records, the surveillance shots of Daniel, the notes planning his death. When she finally lowered the phone, her chest heaved with ragged breaths. The reality pressed down on her, heavier than the sea outside. The man she had married hadn't just stolen her present. He had stolen her past, destroyed her future with Daniel, and planned it all with chilling precision. Natalie sank onto the folding chair, her gown from that night now replaced with jeans and a sweater. But she felt just as fragile, just as exposed. The world tilted around her, the storage unit spinning into a vortex of horror. For a long moment, she buried her face in her hands, muffling a sob that clawed its way out. But when she lifted her head, her eyes burned with something new. She could not collapse. She could not give Chris the satisfaction of breaking her. Every page, every photograph, every note was a weapon now, and she would wield them. Wiping her face with trembling fingers, Natalie closed the files carefully, restoring the unit to its exact order. She slipped out into the night, the city's salt wind lashing her cheeks, her phone heavy with secrets that would one day expose Christopher Hale. For the first time since Daniel's death, her grief had a direction. It had purpose, and it carried the name of the man who thought he owned her. The storage unit door groaned shut behind her, the metallic click echoing down the empty corridor. Natalie's pulse raced as she slid the files back into place, forcing her hands to stop trembling. She had taken the photographs she needed. She had proof now, more than she ever imagined. But the air felt heavier, charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Curiosity, a voice drawled behind her, isn't always a virtue. Natalie spun around. Chris stood in the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway. His suit jacket was off, sleeves rolled, his expression taut with fury barely contained. The sight of him here, now, turned her stomach cold. Her phone slipped slightly in her hand, and she gripped it tighter, hiding it behind her back. "Chris," she said, forcing calm into her voice. I was just... Spare me," he cut in, stepping fully inside and shutting the door with deliberate force. The sound reverberated like a prison gate. "You think I don't know when someone's been meddling in my affairs? You think I wouldn't notice you following threads that don't belong to you?" Natalie swallowed hard, her back pressing against the table as he advanced. "You killed him," she whispered, the words escaping before she could hold them. "Daniel, you planned everything." Chris's smile was razor thin. "Finally," she says it aloud. "Yes, Natalie, I did. And why shouldn't I? Daniel was nothing. A moralist in a world run by wolves. He stood between me and your father's empire. He had to go." Her chest constricted, every breath sharp. "You admit it," she said. "Of course I admit it," Chris sneered, pacing the small space like a predator circling prey. "What difference does it make? Who would believe you? To the world. You're the grieving fiancé who rushed into my arms too soon. To your father, I'm the golden boy who understands business in a way Daniel never could. You tell them your little theory, and you'll sound delusional." Natalie lifted her chin, despite the tremor in her body. "I have proof. I have everything I need." His eyes darted to her hands. "Your phone," he said softly, menace curling in his tone. He lunged forward, fingers outstretched to seize it. Natalie jerked back, clutching the device against her chest. "Don't." Chris slammed a hand onto the table, sending files scattering to the floor. "Give it to me, Natalie. Now, or I'll make sure you don't leave this room." Her heart pounded, fear clawing at her throat. The narrow space shrank as he moved closer, his shadow swallowing hers. She backed against the wall, clutching the phone so tightly her knuckles blanched. "You think you're clever," Chris hissed. "Sneaking in here, snapping pictures like some amateur spy? You don't understand what you're up against. These people, my partners, they won't hesitate to clean up a loose end. And if I tell them you've become a problem, you'll disappear faster than Daniel ever did." Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to lower her gaze. "You'd kill me too," she said, her voice breaking. "If I have to," he replied coldly. "You're useful now. But if you turn into a liability, well, I've dealt with that before, haven't I?" He lunged again, his hand closing around her wrist, trying to wrest the phone away. Pain shot up her arm as she fought back, her breath ragged. "Let go!" she cried, twisting desperately. Chris's face was inches from hers, his teeth bared. "You should have stayed obedient. Played the role I gave you. Now you've ruined everything." And then, not quite, a voice snapped. The storage unit door burst open. Light flooded in as Henry Collins stepped inside, gun drawn, badge flashing. Behind him, 2 plainclothes officers surged in, weapons raised. "Christopher Hale!" Henry barked, step away from her. "Now." Chris froze, shock flashing across his face before rage twisted it. "You!" he spat, recognition dawning. "The waiter." Henry's expression was grim. "Undercover. And you've just confessed to everything on camera." Natalie's breath caught. She glanced up. There, nestled in the corner of the unit, a small black device blinked red. A hidden camera. Every word Chris had spoken had been recorded. "No," Chris snarled, his grip tightening on her wrist. "She set me up." "You set yourself up," Henry cut him off. "Every word out of your mouth just sealed your fate." The officers moved swiftly, prying Chris's hand off Natalie and forcing him face down against the table. Papers crumpled beneath him as handcuffs clicked into place. He fought, but the struggle was useless against trained hands and the weight of truth, now exposed. Natalie stumbled back, clutching her wrist, her chest heaving. Relief and shock collided in her veins. She watched as Chris's fury boiled into incoherent shouts. His composure shattered, the mask ripped away. Henry turned to her, his voice gentler now. "You're safe, Mrs. Hale. We've been building this case for months. Your courage gave us the last piece we needed." Natalie's knees nearly buckled. She steadied herself against the wall, staring at Chris pinned beneath the weight of the law, his empire of lies collapsing in the span of minutes. For the first time since Daniel's death, she felt the scales begin to balance. Justice had found its way in, The courthouse in downtown Boston loomed gray against a pale winter sky, its granite steps slick with slush. Reporters crowded near the entrance, their cameras flashing as Christopher Hale was escorted inside in shackles, flanked by federal marshals. The man who once commanded every room with charm and confidence now kept his eyes fixed on the floor, jaw tight, the mask of power long since stripped away. Natalie sat quietly in the gallery, her hands folded in her lap, her breath shallow but steady. The months leading to this moment had been relentless. Interviews with detectives, depositions, sleepless nights reviewing the evidence she had risked everything to gather. Each photograph, each file, each recorded word had been catalogued, scrutinized, sealed into the record. The case against Chris was airtight. The prosecution painted the picture clearly for the jury. Conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, corruption. They detailed how Chris had orchestrated Daniel Brooks's death, how he had cultivated Natalie's grief to worm his way into her family, and how he had plotted to secure millions through the redevelopment of the Boston Harbor Warehouse District. Every piece of evidence, from the surveillance photos to the payment ledgers, from the maps to his own recorded confession in the storage unit, built a story so damning there was no room for doubt. Natalie listened, her chest heavy. She heard her own name again and again, spoken by lawyers, witnesses, the judge. Each mention made her feel both central and peripheral, as though she were both the victim and an observer watching a play unfold from which she could not escape. Chris sat at the defense table, his suit immaculate, his hair combed, but there was no disguising the strain in his face. His attorneys tried to argue entrapment, that his words had been coerced, that he had exaggerated in the heat of anger. But the jury had seen the photographs. They had read the meticulous notes, the chilling option A and option B. They had heard him sneer about Daniel being in the way. No defense could undo the clarity of that truth. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, the courtroom exhaled as one. Natalie closed her eyes, gripping the edge of the bench. A low murmur swept through the gallery, reporters scribbling furiously. Chris's shoulder stiffened, but he made no sound. Sentencing followed weeks later. Natalie attended again, her father at her side. Thomas Morgan looked gaunt, aged by the weight of betrayal. His once booming presence seemed quieter now, dulled by shame. He leaned toward Natalie before the judge entered, his voice raw. "I should have seen it. I brought him into our lives. I gave him my trust. And now," he trailed off, shaking his head. Natalie placed her hand over his, her touch gentle but firm. "Don't blame yourself, Dad. He fooled everyone, not just you." The judge entered, and the room rose, the ritual a sober reminder of the gravity of the moment. The sentencing was swift. 15 years in federal prison. Chris showed no outward reaction, though a flicker of fury crossed his features when the gavel struck. His empire, his plans, his carefully woven lies, all dismantled in one final decree. Natalie watched him led away in cuffs, his figure shrinking as the marshals guided him through the side door. Once, she might have imagined feeling triumph, vindication, even joy, but none of that came. Instead, an unexpected hollowness settled inside her, like the echo left after a storm passes and the silence feels louder than the wind. Justice had been done. Daniel's death had not been forgotten, not buried beneath lies. The world knew the truth now, and Chris would pay for what he had done. Yet Natalie felt no surge of victory. There was no reclaiming what she had lost. Daniel would never walk through her door again, never smile at her across a crowded room, never laugh with her under Boston streetlights. As they exited the courthouse, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing in bursts. Natalie kept her gaze forward, her hand still resting lightly on her father's arm. She heard Thomas mutter, almost to himself, "I trusted him with everything." Natalie squeezed his hand. "He deceived us all. That's what predators do. But it's over now." And yet, as they reached the car, she felt only the faintest relief. Not happiness, not vengeance satisfied, but a tired exhale of weight she had carried too long. Justice had spoken, but justice could not fill the empty seat beside her or warm the bed where grief still lingered. For Natalie, the sentence was not an ending. It was a line drawn in history, a boundary between what had been stolen and what might still be reclaimed. And as she looked back at the courthouse steps, she knew the real work, the rebuilding, the healing, was only just beginning. The cemetery lay quiet beneath a pale summer sky, the kind of stillness that made even the birds hold their songs. 6 months had passed since the gavel fell in the Boston courtroom, since Christopher Hale was sentenced and led away in shackles. For Natalie Morgan, those months had been both a blur and a reckoning. She walked slowly along the gravel path, carrying a small bouquet of lilies, Daniel's favorite. The hem of her dress brushed her ankles, light in the warm breeze, her steps steady. The weight she carried now was different from before, not the crushing grief of helplessness, but something quieter, more bearable. At Daniel Brooks's grave, she knelt, setting the flowers gently against the stone. Her fingers lingered on the carved letters of his name. For a long moment, she simply breathed, letting the silence wrap around her. Then, softly, she began to speak. "It's over," she whispered. "He's gone. They know what he did to you. To us. He'll spend the next 15 years behind bars." Her voice caught, but she steadied it. "I thought I would feel triumphant when that day came, but I didn't. I only felt lighter, like a storm finally moved on." She closed her eyes, remembering Chris's cold smile in the storage unit, the fury in his voice when he realized he'd been caught. Remembering, too, the finality of the judge's sentence. Justice had been served, but it had not brought Daniel back. Nothing ever could. "I moved," she continued quietly, brushing her thumb along the stone. Beacon Hill held too many ghosts, too many memories of him. So I found a place of my own, a little apartment near the river. It's small, nothing fancy, but it's mine. And when I open the windows in the morning, I can hear the water. It reminds me of peace." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "I've started volunteering too, with a foundation that supports families who've lost loved ones in traffic accidents. It's hard sometimes hearing their stories, but it helps knowing I can turn my pain into something useful. That Daniel's memory isn't just grief, it's action. It's comfort for others." She fell silent for a moment, listening to the rustle of leaves in the summer wind. In that hush, she thought about the people she had met through the charity, the widows, the children, the men who carried scars deeper than any doctor could heal. She thought about how, in helping them, she had started to heal herself. Her hand rested lightly on the cool stone. "I also met someone," she admitted softly, almost shyly, as if confessing a secret. "He's an artist, a painter. I met him through the charity. He volunteers at events, paints portraits to raise money. His name is Mark. He's kind, gentle. He doesn't push. He just listens." She drew in a breath, steadying the emotion in her chest. "It's nothing serious yet. I'm not ready for that, but maybe someday. For now, it's just nice to have a friend who sees me without expecting anything more." The sun slipped behind a cloud, casting a soft shadow across the headstone. Natalie brushed a strand of hair from her face, her eyes calm. "I'll always love you, Daniel," she whispered. "You were my first forever. But I know now that love doesn't die with loss. It changes. It becomes something I carry with me, something that helps me keep going." She stood slowly, smoothing her dress. The lilies lay bright against the gray stone, a quiet testament to the man who had once been her future. As she stepped back, the heaviness in her chest eased, replaced by a strange, steady warmth. Natalie turned toward the path, the sunlight breaking through again, washing the cemetery in golden light. She walked with a quiet certainty, her footsteps sure. Ahead of her waited a life not defined by betrayal or grief, but by the choices she now made for herself. There would still be scars, still nights haunted by memories of headlights on wet pavement, of lies whispered in the dark. But there would also be mornings filled with river air, afternoons spent helping others heal, evenings where laughter didn't feel foreign. For the first time in years, Natalie felt she could breathe without weight pressing down on her chest. The future was no longer a cage built by someone else's ambition. It was hers. As she reached the gates of the cemetery, she paused, looking back once more at Daniel's grave. Her lips curved into a quiet smile. "From the pieces of what's broken," she whispered, "I'll build something real. Something true." And with that, Natalie Morgan stepped into the light of her new life. Free at last, her past no longer a chain but a foundation for the woman she was becoming.